No one remembers the exact moment history begins to change. It never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with drums or banners. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, usually in the life of someone the world has already decided doesn't matter. This story begins like that, without applause, without witnesses, without mercy. He started with nothing, not almost nothing, not less than most, nothing. No money, no influence, no safety net, no last name that opened doors, no mentor waiting to guide him, no inheritance hidden somewhere in the past. Just a boy born into circumstances so ordinary and unforgiving that the world never bothered to expect anything from him. The town he grew up in barely existed on maps, a place people passed through, not a place they stayed. Rusted factories on the outskirts, cracked sidewalks downtown, and houses that looked like they'd been tired for generations. His parents worked hard in the way poor people always do. Long hours, little progress, constant worry disguised as routine. They taught him honesty, endurance, and how to survive. They could not teach him how to win, because they had never been shown how. As a child, he noticed things other children ignored. He noticed how the same people stayed poor no matter how hard they worked. He noticed how some men spoke less but decided more. He noticed that rules were enforced differently depending on who you were. He didn't have words for these observations yet, but they lodged themselves deep inside him, waiting. School didn't reward curiosity like his. It rewarded obedience, memorization, and conformity. He was good enough to pass, never good enough to stand out. Teachers described him as quiet, capable, unremarkable. That word followed him for years. Unremarkable, invisible, safe to ignore. By his late teens, life had already narrowed its options. Work was necessary. Dreams were optional luxuries. He took whatever jobs were available: warehouses, delivery routes, clerical work, night shifts no one else wanted. Each paycheck disappeared as fast as it arrived. Rent, food, utilities, survival consumed everything. Still, he watched, always watched. He watched how companies wasted money. He watched how managers made decisions based on fear instead of logic. He watched how systems broke down, not because people were evil, but because they were lazy, rushed, or protected by bureaucracy. Most people complained. He memorized patterns. In his 20s, he tried what society told him to try: hard work, loyalty, patience. He waited for promotions that never came. He trusted promises that quietly expired. He stayed late, he volunteered, he made himself useful. And slowly, painfully, he learned a truth that would later define his life. Effort alone is never what history rewards. By 30, he had failed by every visible measure. No savings, no assets, no career momentum. The kind of failure that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but feels suffocating on the inside. The kind where you don't collapse, you simply disappear. That was when the mistake happened. Not his mistake, America's. It was a financial decision made far above his head, in rooms he would never enter, by men who spoke confidently about numbers they barely understood. A shortcut taken, a safeguard ignored, a risk justified because it hadn't failed yet. The kind of history always punishes, but never immediately. Markets shifted, credit tightened, businesses froze, jobs vanished. Panic spread quietly before it spread loudly. People like him felt it first. Hours cut, contracts canceled, promises revoked. What little stability he had evaporated overnight. And while millions panicked, he observed something else. He saw confusion. He saw powerful people reacting instead of thinking. He saw systems collapsing, not because they were attacked, but because they had been built on assumptions no one questioned. Most people experienced the crisis as pain. He experienced it as clarity. For the first time, the world slowed down enough for him to see how it actually worked. Banks didn't fail because they lacked money. They failed because they lacked trust. Companies didn't collapse because demand disappeared. They collapsed because timing did. Supply chains broke. Information lagged. Decision makers waited too long or acted too fast. He realized something dangerous. The system wasn't complex. It was fragile. And fragility meant opportunity. He didn't start a company, he didn't invent anything, he didn't raise capital. He did something far less impressive and far more effective. He positioned himself between problems and solutions. He took temporary work where chaos was worst. He accepted roles others avoided. He listened. He mapped flows, money, goods, decisions. He learned who actually had power versus who merely had titles. He learned where things stalled, where they leaked, where small changes produced disproportionate results. While others chased recovery, he studied failure. While others begged for security, he built relevance. He offered fixes no one else saw, not big reforms, small adjustments, timing changes, cost reductions that didn't feel painful. He asked for nothing up front, only results-based compensation. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. Because once people depended on him to stop losses, they started listening to him about growth. By the time the economy stabilized, he was no longer just another worker. He was embedded, quietly essential, known not publicly, but internally by the people who mattered. History doesn't remember men like this at first. It only notices them later, when removing them becomes impossible. He reinvested every dollar, not into lifestyle, into access, information, relationships, leverage. He stayed invisible by design. He let others take credit. He learned that recognition creates enemies faster than results. Then came the second shock, another financial mistake, bigger this time, louder, one that almost broke the country completely. And when it did, when the markets convulsed, when institutions begged for rescue, when history trembled, he was ready. Not with money, with understanding. He knew where the pressure points were. He knew what could not fail. He knew what would be saved at all costs. He knew what would be sacrificed. He placed himself accordingly. By the time the headlines declared recovery, he was no longer surviving history. He was shaping it. And this was only the beginning.
The mistake didn't explode all at once. That's the lie people tell later, because explosions are easier to understand than erosion. The truth was slower, uglier, and far more dangerous. It began as a harmless adjustment, buried deep inside balance sheets no ordinary citizen would ever read. Risk was repackaged, responsibility was diluted, short-term comfort was chosen over long-term stability, and everyone who mattered agreed to look the other way, because looking closely would have meant slowing down profit. He watched it happen from the margins. Banks extended credit as if consequences had been permanently canceled. Financial instruments multiplied faster than anyone could explain them. Trust became a substitute for verification. Regulators relied on models built on past behavior, blind to the fact that the present was already different. It wasn't greed alone that caused it. It was arrogance, the belief that the system had outgrown failure. For most people, the economy was an abstract thing, a number on the news, a line on a chart. For him, it was human behavior under pressure. He noticed how incentives shaped decisions. He noticed how fear hid behind confidence. He noticed how people deferred responsibility upward, assuming someone else had checked the math. No one had. When the cracks widened, denial filled them. Losses were reclassified, deadlines extended, liquidity injected. Each fix bought time and burned credibility. And then, finally, the moment arrived when pretending stopped working. The collapse didn't start on Main Street. It started in conference rooms where voices dropped and phones rang more often than usual. Deals froze mid-sentence, emails went unanswered, meetings multiplied without conclusions. The language shifted from growth to exposure, from opportunity to containment. And then it reached the streets. Companies cut staff not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Credit vanished overnight. Perfectly viable businesses suffocated without cash flow. People who had done everything right found themselves one missed paycheck from disaster. The country felt stunned, like a boxer who hadn't seen the punch coming. Panic looks different depending on where you stand. For some, it was loud, headlines, protests, anger. For others, it was silent, missed meals, sleepless nights, quiet shame. He moved through all of it unnoticed, gathering something far more valuable than money: information. He learned which institutions would be rescued and which would be allowed to fail. He learned how political optics shaped financial decisions. He learned that too big to fail didn't mean too important to reform. It meant too dangerous to let collapse suddenly. Timing, again, was everything. While others tried to predict recovery, he mapped dependencies: who owed whom, who relied on which pipelines, what functions were irreplaceable even when companies were. He realized that power didn't sit where the spotlight pointed. It sat where interruption caused the most damage. So he positioned himself there. He didn't gamble, he didn't speculate wildly, he aligned. He offered continuity when chaos threatened. He helped move resources when bottlenecks appeared. He facilitated quiet agreements between parties too scared to trust each other openly. He charged modestly, he delivered consistently. Trust, once broken nationally, was rebuilt locally, one transaction at a time. As the government intervened, as policies shifted, as bailouts stabilized headlines but not lives, he grew stronger precisely because he wasn't visible. He didn't need public confidence, he needed private reliance, and he earned it. By now, people came to him before decisions were announced, not because he had authority, but because he had foresight. He didn't predict markets, he predicted reactions. He knew when fear would override logic. He knew when relief would be mistaken for recovery. And when the rebound finally came, uneven and fragile, it rewarded those already positioned, not those who had waited patiently. History paid him then, quietly, relentlessly. Assets moved into his orbit, contracts favored his structures, systems bent around his presence without ever naming him as the cause. He reinvested again, not into symbols of success, but into control points, logistics, data, financing channels that functioned regardless of economic mood. He had started with nothing, but now history owed him something, and it was paying in leverage. Yet even as his influence grew, he remembered how close everything had come to collapse. He understood that systems fail not from a single blow, but from accumulated neglect. That understanding made him cautious where others grew bold. It made him patient where others rushed. Another mistake would come. He knew it. History always repeats its habits, if not its exact steps. The question was never if. It was who would be ready when it did. And this time, he wouldn't just survive it. He would decide who did.
The second shock didn't feel like a crisis at first. That was the most dangerous part. It arrived disguised as stability. Markets were calmer. Headlines spoke of recovery. Confidence returned, cautiously at first, then recklessly. People wanted to believe the worst was over, so they did. That belief became policy. He didn't celebrate, he watched. He noticed how safeguards added after the last collapse were already being softened. Temporary measures quietly expired. Emergency rules were relaxed to encourage growth. Risk crept back in, slower this time, smarter, wrapped in new language but driven by the same incentives. Human nature hadn't changed, only memory had faded. This was when his role changed. Before, he had been useful. Now he became necessary. Institutions leaned on him not just to fix problems, but to prevent embarrassment. He wasn't called when things broke. He was called before decisions were made. He sat in rooms where people spoke carefully, aware that outcomes mattered more than intentions. He never raised his voice. He never rushed conclusions. He let others talk themselves into revealing what they feared most. Fear, he had learned, was the most accurate data source available. He began shaping outcomes without issuing commands. A suggestion here, a delay there, a connection introduced at exactly the right moment. Deals shifted direction not because he forced them, but because his presence subtly altered risk calculations. People felt safer when he agreed, nervous when he didn't. Power rarely announces itself. It accumulates until others behave as if it's already there. Then came the near-fatal error. A financial instrument, hailed as innovation, spread rapidly across markets. It promised efficiency, liquidity, protection. On paper, it looked brilliant. In practice, it tied together institutions that should never have been connected so tightly. One failure could cascade. One miscalculation could ripple outward at unimaginable speed. He saw it immediately. Not because he was smarter, but because he understood flow. He traced dependencies like a map of fault lines. He tested assumptions no one else questioned, and what he saw frightened him, not for himself, but for the system. He warned people quietly, not publicly. Public warnings triggered denial. He spoke in private to those with influence but little appetite for blame. Some listened, most didn't. The profits were too good, the momentum too strong. History repeated its favorite mistake, mistaking motion for safety. When the instrument finally wobbled, reactions were delayed. When it cracked, responses were fragmented, and when it failed everywhere at once. This time, the country didn't collapse. It almost did. Markets seized, confidence evaporated. Institutions stared at numbers they couldn't explain fast enough to control. The difference between survival and catastrophe came down to hours, to decisions made under pressure by people who had never planned for this exact scenario. That's when he stepped fully into the open, just enough. He coordinated responses across entities that legally couldn't appear coordinated. He moved resources before approvals were finalized. He interpreted policy intent faster than policy language could be written. He became the informal bridge holding fragmented systems together while the official structures caught up. No one appointed him, they simply followed. Afterward, when the dust settled and the country exhaled, committees formed to understand what had happened. Reports were written, blame was diluted across acronyms and timelines. The public learned simplified versions of the truth, but behind closed doors, a different understanding spread. There had been a man who knew where to stand when everything shook, and he had started with nothing. From that moment on, history treated him differently. Doors opened before he knocked, laws were written with his constraints in mind, markets adjusted in anticipation of his moves. Not because he was feared, but because he was predictable in the only way that mattered. He acted in alignment with systemic survival. He didn't own everything. He controlled enough of the critical pathways that ownership became optional. His wealth grew, but it was a side effect. Influence grew faster. Influence compounds differently. It doesn't fluctuate with markets. It survives crashes. It shapes recoveries. He began acquiring quietly, not companies, but positions, seats, voting power, advisory roles that came with real authority but little visibility. He diversified across sectors that insulated each other,
Failure in one strengthened the others. People called it genius later. He called it preparation. Yet even now he remembered the boy from the forgotten town, the worker nobody noticed, the man who had nothing when history made its first mistake. That memory kept him sharp. It reminded him that control is temporary and arrogance invites correction. History always tests its favorites. The question was whether he would pass the final one, because the last mistake, the one that would decide everything, was already forming.
The final mistake didn't come from greed. That's what made it lethal. It came from certainty, the belief that the system was finally mature enough to manage itself, that safeguards were sufficient, that history had been learned. History, as always, disagreed. The world had changed faster than its rules. Capital moved at the speed of code. Decisions traveled through algorithms before humans could question them. Efficiency had erased friction, and friction, it turned out, had been the only thing preventing collapse. When everything moved instantly, there was no time left to think. He saw it before anyone named it. A convergence, too many systems optimized for speed, too few for resilience. One shock wouldn't break them, but a synchronized shock, one political, one financial, one psychological, could. He didn't try to stop it. Stopping history is impossible. He prepared to survive it and to decide what came after. When the pressure finally hit, it wasn't a single event, it was a cascade. Markets swung wildly, confidence fractured along invisible lines. Institutions hesitated, afraid of acting too soon and being blamed, too late and being irrelevant. The country hovered on the edge of a decision it didn't know it was making. This time he didn't stay invisible. He didn't appear on television. He didn't give speeches. He moved through channels of power the public never sees. Emergency calls, backroom agreements, temporary authorities granted under extraordinary circumstances. He became the reference point when no rule book applied. People deferred to him not because he demanded it, but because he had been right too many times before. Resources were redirected, failures were contained. Some institutions were allowed to fall, not out of cruelty, but necessity. History always demands sacrifice. He simply chose where it would hurt least long term. The country survived, barely. When stability returned, it returned differently, more centralized, more cautious, more aware of its own fragility. And woven into its new structure were mechanisms he had designed, advised, or quietly insisted upon. By then, his wealth was no longer countable in simple numbers. It existed in influence, in veto power, in permanence. He didn't own history. History owed him. Journalists would later argue about who deserved credit. Politicians would claim leadership. Institutions would rewrite their own roles. His name appeared occasionally, never loudly, always respectfully. But the truth was simpler. A man who started with nothing had understood something others ignored. Systems don't fail because people are evil. They fail because people stop paying attention. He had paid attention, from the beginning, from the forgotten town, from the invisible jobs, from the first quiet mistake no one noticed until it was too late. He had watched, learned, positioned himself, and waited, not for opportunity, but for inevitability. History doesn't reward effort, it rewards alignment. It rewards those who understand when to move and when to let others collapse under their own assumptions. He never claimed to be a hero. Heroes burn out. He became something rarer, a constant, a stabilizing force shaped by scarcity, sharpened by failure, disciplined by patience. He started with nothing. History paid him everything, not as a gift, but as a debt. And the most unsettling part? History would do it again. for anyone watching closely enough to see the next mistake forming.